The fold space jump went wrong in the span of a heartbeat. One moment, the Guild Hayliner voice of Kaiden hung suspended in the spice-saturated void between stars, its navigator folding space with the practiced certainty of 10,000 successful transits. The next, something tore. Not metaphorically. The fabric of dimensional space physically shredded along a fault line that had no business existing, a resonance cascade triggered by a subspace anomaly unique to this universe, one no prescient navigator had ever foreseen because no navigator had ever looked here. The Hayliner's rear cargo hold, containing the 3rd Legion of the Imperial Sardaukar. 42,000 soldiers, their command staff, tactical ornithopters, and the personal retinue of Burseg Aramsham, commander of the Emperor's most feared mobile force, was severed from the jump entirely and deposited, catastrophically, into real space. The Hayliner disappeared. The Legion did not. What remained was a command ship the size of a small moon, 3 destroyer-class escorts, and a debris field of shattered fold space energy expanding across 2 light-years of space near a star system the Sardaukar's instruments had no name for. The stars were wrong. The radiation signatures were wrong. And the signals bleeding through the void on electromagnetic frequencies, structured, mathematical, unmistakably intelligent, were entirely unrecognized. Burseg Aramsham stood on the command deck of the Righteous Blade and did not panic. Panic was something the weak permitted themselves. He had been raised on Solissa Secundus, where panic was a death sentence before your 3rd year of life. He surveyed the tactical display with the flat, evaluating calm of a man who had conquered 30 worlds, suppressed 6 planetary rebellions, and once held a mountain pass for 11 days against forces 50 times his strength using nothing but knives, terrain, and the absolute certainty that his soldiers would not break. "Navigator status," he said. "Dead, Burseg. The fold space rupture destroyed the navigator's tank on separation. We have no prescient guidance. Fold space capability? The Holtzman engine sustained catastrophic damage. Estimate 60 to 90 standard days for partial restoration, assuming we can source compatible materials." Aramsham absorbed this without expression. 60 days in an unknown system. He turned to his intelligence officer, Coordinatrix Vel, a sharp-featured woman whose eyes carried the particular flatness of someone who had never once made a decision based on sentiment. "Analysis of the signals? Multiple intelligence sources. At least 3 distinct technological signatures within sensor range. The nearest is a patrol vessel, small, fast, armed with directed energy weapons of unfamiliar design. It has been orbiting at a cautious distance for approximately 40 minutes. It has not attacked." She paused. "It appears to be waiting." "Waiting," Aramsham repeated, as if the word were mildly distasteful. "For communication, most likely. The signals we're receiving include mathematical sequences consistent with first contact protocols." Aramsham clasped his hands behind his back and studied the distant blip on the tactical screen. A patrol vessel. Small. Cautious. Sending greeting signals rather than weapons fire. He had encountered gestures of diplomacy before, from worlds that believed goodwill could substitute for strength. He had also encountered worlds that used diplomatic delay as cover for military buildup. "Prepare a full tactical assessment of this system's inhabited worlds," he said. "Population estimates, resource analysis, defensive infrastructure. If we cannot return home in 60 days through our own means, we will need to acquire what we require through other means. And the patrol vessel? Let it watch. Knowledge flows in both directions. While they study us, we study them." He moved to the viewport, gazing out at the unfamiliar star field. "Send no response. Silence tells them nothing. But alert all Legion commanders. Conditioning drills are suspended. Combat readiness is now continuous." 3 light-years away, on the bridge of the USS Zapata, Lieutenant Commander Yelena Abrescu stared at her sensor readings with the particular expression of someone who had just discovered that the universe had decided to stop behaving itself. The object on her screen was not in any Starfleet database. Its energy signature bore traces of something that resembled, but was fundamentally not, warp technology. It had appeared from nowhere, accompanied by what her instruments described only as a dimensional shear event, and it was, by conservative estimate, 11 kilometers long. She had sent the standard first contact mathematical greeting 4 times. She had received nothing. She opened a channel to Starbase 47. This is Zapata to command. We have a situation at grid reference 779 Mark 12. Recommend immediate dispatch of a senior diplomatic vessel. She glanced at her tactical officer. And tell them to skip the ambassador and send a captain. Whatever this is, it didn't come here to talk. She was more right than she knew. If you want to see more crossover invasions tear through the Star Trek universe, hit subscribe and drop a character in the comments. Live long and prosper. The Enterprise D dropped out of warp at the edge of the anomaly zone with the quiet authority of a vessel that had faced the Borg, negotiated with godlike entities, and charted the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood at the center of his bridge, hands clasped behind his back, studying the object on the view screen with the focused intensity of a man who understood that first impressions in first contact situations were often irreversible. The righteous blade was enormous. Even at this distance, its sheer mass registered on every sensor panel simultaneously. It was not beautiful in any Federation aesthetic sense. It was functional, brutal, designed with the sole purpose of projecting overwhelming force across interplanetary distances. Its hull bore no markings that the universal translator could parse, no energy signatures consistent with any known warp-capable civilization, and no response to 14 separate hailing frequencies across every electromagnetic band Starfleet possessed. "Counselor," Picard said quietly. Deanna Troi sat forward in her chair, her expression concentrated. "I'm sensing life signs, Captain. Many thousands of them. The dominant emotional signature is..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Disciplined. Controlled to a degree I've rarely encountered. There's alertness, watchfulness, but no fear. Whatever they are not afraid of us." "That could mean confidence," Riker said from Picard's left. "Or it could mean they simply don't regard us as a threat. Or both," Data offered from Ops. "I am also detecting residual energy consistent with a dimensional shear event. The vessel did not arrive via conventional warp travel." The spatial distortion pattern suggests something closer to a folded space transit, a theoretical propulsion method that bypasses normal spacetime entirely rather than moving through it. Picard absorbed this. "Any response to our hails?" "None, sir," Worf reported from Tactical, his voice carrying the particular edge it always carried when he had been watching something potentially dangerous for too long without being permitted to act. "However, I am detecting active sensor sweeps from the vessel. They are studying us extensively. Hull composition analysis, weapons assessment, crew population estimates. They're doing exactly what we're doing," Riker said. "Yes," Picard agreed. "Which means they are cautious, methodical, and intelligent. All qualities that suggest communication should be possible." He straightened. "Open all hailing frequencies. Universal translator active on all known and theoretical language matrices. Mr. Data, is there any linguistic pattern in the signals they've been broadcasting internally?" "I have been analyzing their internal communications, Captain. The language is unlike anything in Federation records, but the translator is identifying structural patterns. Estimated time to basic comprehension, 4 to 6 hours of continued exposure. Then we give them time." Picard settled into his chair. "We maintain position, we continue hailing, and we demonstrate patience. Whatever brought them here, they are stranded. The dimensional shear event shows no sign of reopening. That makes them potentially frightened, regardless of what Counselor Troi senses, and frightened beings with weapons require careful handling." On the Righteous Blade, Coordinatrix Vel watched the Federation starship hold its position and felt something she rarely permitted herself: grudging respect. Most civilizations, confronted with an object of this size appearing without warning in their space, either attacked immediately or fled. This vessel had done neither. It had taken position at a respectful distance and was simply waiting. "They are patient," she told Aramsham. "Patient people are either very confident or very wise," the Berseg replied. "Determine which." The standoff continued for 3 hours. Then Vel's instruments registered something new, a second ship dropping out of warp. Then a third. Then, over the following 90 minutes, 7 more. Each one positioned itself deliberately, forming a loose but unmistakable perimeter. Not an attack formation. A containment posture. "They've called for assistance," Vel said. "Of course they have." Aramsham studied the new arrivals. All similar in design to the first vessel. All maintaining the same careful, non-aggressive positioning. They are a collective power. A coalition. This is their border response protocol. He turned to his tactical staff. "How many soldiers can we land on the nearest inhabited world within 12 hours? The third planet in the adjacent system shows population signatures and infrastructure. We could deploy 6,000 troops by ornithopter within 8 hours. Prepare them." He held up a hand before Vel could object. "Not for immediate deployment. For readiness. I want options, coordinatrix, not commitments. These patient, wise people have just demonstrated that they have more ships than we initially estimated." He looked back at the view screen. "Which means this coalition is larger than this border region suggests. We need to understand its full scope before we act." Back on the Enterprise, Data looked up from his console. "Captain? I have achieved basic linguistic comprehension. I believe I can now establish rudimentary communication." Picard leaned forward. "Open a channel, Mr. Data." The view screen flickered. For a moment there was nothing, static darkness, the hiss of an open channel meeting silence. Then a figure appeared. Tall, severe, dressed in gray armor that bore no decoration beyond a single geometric symbol at the chest. The face was angular, weathered, utterly expressionless. Dark eyes surveyed the bridge of the Enterprise with the calm, comprehensive gaze of a predator assessing new terrain. Picard stood. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the United Federation of Planets, aboard the Starship Enterprise. We welcome you to this region of space and offer assistance." Data translated. A pause. The figure on screen studied Picard for a long moment. Then, in a voice that carried the flat, absolute certainty of someone who had never once in their life doubted their own authority, the figure spoke 4 words that the universal translator rendered with perfect clarity. "Assess your military strength." Picard kept his expression neutral. Beside him, he heard Riker exhale very slowly. "They're not here to talk," his first officer murmured. "No," Picard agreed quietly. "But they're talking. That's something." He met the figure's gaze on the view screen and kept his voice measured and calm. "Before we discuss military matters, I would very much like to understand who you are and what you need." The figure's eyes moved across the bridge one more time, cataloging, assessing, filing. Then the channel closed. The first real indication of what the Sardaukar were came not from a briefing room analysis or a diplomatic exchange, but from a smoking crater on the outskirts of Cardassia Prime's third-largest city. A Cardassian patrol had intercepted one of the Righteous Blade S ornithopters conducting what Aramsham's staff termed a terrain assessment of the Cardassian border worlds. The Cardassian response had been immediate and proportionate by their own standards. For warships, a complement of ground troops, and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from being a military power that had occupied Bajorans for 50 years and considered itself among the hardest civilizations in the quadrant. The ornithopter carried 40 Sardaukar. The Cardassian response force numbered 300 soldiers and 4 vessels. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Data presented the sensor reconstruction to the senior staff in the Enterprise briefing room with the careful, precise detachment he brought to all analyses, though even he seemed to pause fractionally longer than usual before beginning. The holographic display above the table showed thermal imaging, energy signatures, and the fragmentary sensor logs recovered from the one Cardassian warship that had survived long enough to transmit data before being disabled. The Cardassian vessels opened fire immediately upon detecting the ornithopter in their sovereign space. Data began. Standard disruptor volleys, full power. The ornithopter deployed what appeared to be personal defensive shields among its troops as they disembarked onto the surface. These shields, he highlighted the relevant data, appeared to interact catastrophically with directed energy weapons. Define catastrophically, Riker said. Each disruptor strike on a shielded Sardaukar soldier produced an explosion equivalent to approximately 400 kilograms of conventional explosive yield. The reaction appears to be an interaction between the shield's Holtzman field, our best approximation of its operating principle, and the phased energy of the disruptor beam. The energy is not absorbed or deflected. It is amplified and detonated. Silence around the table. The Cardassians were, in effect, bombing their own troops, Beverly Crusher said quietly. Correct. The surface engagement became non-viable for energy weapon use within the first 90 seconds. The Cardassian ground forces switched to hand-to-hand combat. Data's pause this time was almost imperceptible. They were not competitive in that environment. The Sardaukar suffered no fatalities. Cardassian casualties were total. Worf's jaw was set in a hard line. What about the warships? The warships continued firing from orbit. The surface explosions from shield interactions destroyed the settlement and much of the Cardassian ground force through shockwave propagation. The Sardaukar soldiers, protected by their shields from the explosive overpressure, survived. When the ornithopter returned to the command ship, the Cardassian fleet pursued. The Righteous Blade S-point defense weapons are conventional kinetic and plasma-based, no phased energy component, and proved highly effective against the Cardassian vessels. Picard stood slowly from his chair and moved to the viewport. Outside, the stars were steady and indifferent. So we cannot use phasers or disruptors against shielded soldiers without causing mass casualty explosions in any proximity to our own people or civilian populations. Correct, Captain? The only safe engagement range for energy weapons would be at a minimum distance of approximately 2 kilometers from any shielded target, effectively ruling out shipboard combat, urban environments, and any close tactical situation. What about unshielded targets? Riker asked. The shields appear to be individually powered. A soldier whose shield generator is destroyed or depleted by repeated kinetic impacts becomes vulnerable to conventional energy weapons. However, based on the Cardassian engagement data, depleting a shield through kinetic means requires sustained fire and close-quarters persistence that the Sardaukar's combat capabilities make extremely costly. Geordi LaForge leaned forward. Could we modify our weapons? Tune phasers to a frequency that doesn't trigger the Holtzman interaction? I am already working on that problem, Lieutenant Commander. However, it requires a detailed understanding of the Holtzman field's resonance properties, data which we do not yet possess. Conservative estimate for a viable solution, 2 to 3 weeks of direct study. We don't have 2 to 3 weeks, Riker said. He was right. The Cardassian Central Command had already filed a formal protest with the Federation Council, demanding military intervention. 3 Klingon houses with territorial claims near the Cardassian border had convened an emergency session of the High Council. And the Righteous Blade had, in the hours since the Cardassia engagement, moved deeper into the border region and established what Starfleet's sensor net identified as a forward operating perimeter, a classic military occupation posture, systematic and deliberate, the work of people who had done this before on many worlds. They're not confused, Crusher said, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. They didn't attack that Cardassian patrol by accident or out of fear. They were conducting a reconnaissance in force. They wanted to see how we fight. And now they know, Troy said. Her voice was troubled in a way that went beyond professional concern. Captain, I've been monitoring the emotional output from the command ship since our communication attempt. What I sense is not aggression in the way we normally understand it. There's no anger, no fear, no hatred. What I sense is... She searched for the word. Purpose. Absolute, unquestioning purpose. These are not soldiers who fight because they're ordered to. They fight because they believe, at the most fundamental level of their psychological conditioning, that conquest is the natural order of existence. Picard turned from the viewport. His expression carried the particular gravity it took on when he understood that a situation had moved beyond the comfortable territory of Federation principles and into somewhere far more difficult. Then we are not dealing with an enemy we can negotiate into peace, he said. We are dealing with an enemy we must give a reason to stop. He looked around the table. Find me that reason. When the High Council convened to discuss the Sardaukar incursion, he listened to the Federation's preliminary reports for approximately 4 minutes before standing, slamming both fists on the council table, and declaring that whatever these gray-armored warriors thought they were, they had not yet met the Klingon Empire. The Federation's caution, their careful sensor analyses and weapons incompatibility studies and diplomatic overtures, were the behavior of people who had forgotten what war actually was. The Klingon had not forgotten. 37 vessels of the Imperial Klingon fleet, including 6 Vorcha-class attack cruisers, entered the border region 16 hours after the Cardassia Prime engagement. They did not hail the Righteous Blade. They did not request diplomatic contact. They dropped out of warp in a tight combat formation, charged their disruptors, and broadcast a single message on all frequencies in the Klingon tongue, which the Universal Translator rendered with complete accuracy. Face us, or be remembered as cowards. On the bridge of the Enterprise, monitoring from a distance at Starfleet Command's insistence, Worf watched the Klingon fleet's approach with an expression that mixed pride with something very close to dread. He had read Data's full analysis 3 times. He understood what was about to happen. And there was nothing he could do to stop it, because the High Council had declined the Federation's warnings with the particular contempt that Klingon warriors reserved for advice they considered timid. Aramsham watched the Klingon fleet on his tactical display and felt something he recognized as professional appreciation. These were warriors. Not the cautious, measured beings of the first vessel, with their patience and their endless hailing frequencies. These beings came to fight. Their formation was aggressive, their weapons were charging, and their emotional communications, even across the void of space, carried the unmistakable signature of people who expected to win and welcomed the test. They are honorable, Bell observed, reading the same data. They are predictable, Aramsham corrected. Honor-bound warriors follow codes. Codes have patterns. Patterns can be exploited. He turned to his tactical staff. All shield generators active on ground forces. Deploy 4 legions to the surface of the 3rd planet in the system below. I want occupation established before the space battle concludes. Whatever the outcome above, we will have ground to stand on. The space battle lasted 40 minutes. It should not have lasted that long. The Klingon fleet's disruptors were powerful, precisely calibrated, and completely lethal against any conventional opponent. Against the Righteous Blade and its escorts, whose point defense systems were kinetic-based and whose whole composition had been specifically engineered over centuries of Sardaukar military development to absorb and deflect energy weapon impacts through layered ablative materials, they were significantly less effective than expected. The Klingon captains adapted. They always adapted. Switching to torpedo salvos and ramming maneuvers, the kind of brutal, close-quarters space combat at which Klingon crews genuinely excelled. They destroyed one of the destroyer escorts. They damaged the Righteous Blade's forward sensor array. They fought, by any objective measure, magnificently. It was not enough. The Righteous Blade's weapons were not energy-based in the phased Starfleet sense. They fired concentrated plasma bolts and kinetic mass drivers that punched through Klingon shield harmonics with methodical efficiency. The Sardaukar ship had been built to fight wars, not to explore or patrol. It had more weapons than any equivalent mass Federation or Klingon vessel, and its crew operated them with the cold, systematic competence of soldiers who had trained every day of their lives for exactly this scenario. 19 Klingon vessels were destroyed. 11 were disabled. 7 survived by going to warp, retreating from the engagement zone, a word that would not appear in their official reports, which would describe a strategic redeployment. Worf said nothing when the final tally appeared on his console. His hands, however, had gripped the edge of the tactical station hard enough that his knuckles showed pale beneath his dark skin. "Captain," Beta said, "I am detecting Sardaukar ground forces deploying to the surface of Narendra 3. The deployment is organized, rapid, and consistent with an occupation protocol rather than a raid. They are moving to establish permanent positions." Picard's voice was quiet. "How many?" "Approximately 16,000 soldiers, sir. With heavy equipment." Riker stood. "Narendra 3 has a civilian population of 2 million. "I am aware, Commander." Picard moved to his command chair with the measured calm of a man who was containing something very large and very cold behind the composed exterior of command. He had watched the Klingon fleet engage with every advantage of numbers and warrior ferocity. He had watched them lose. The Sardaukar had not been damaged meaningfully. They had not been surprised. They had absorbed the most aggressive military force in the Alpha Quadrant's conventional arsenal and responded with textbook efficiency. And now they were occupying a civilian world. "Hail the righteous blade," he said. The channel opened. Aramsham's face appeared on the view screen. He looked, if anything, slightly less interested than he had during their first exchange, the look of a man whose hypothesis had been confirmed and who was now moving to the next phase of his plan. "Commander," Picard said, choosing the title deliberately, implying equal standing rather than subordination. "The world your forces are occupying is under Federation protection. The people there are civilians. I am asking you to withdraw your ground forces and return to your vessels so that we may find a resolution to your situation that does not require further violence." Aramsham studied him. "Your warriors attacked us first." "Yes. And I regret that. It was a mistake made out of fear and misunderstanding, not policy." Picard kept his voice even. "I am asking you for the opportunity to correct that mistake." A long pause. "Then, the world has resources we require. We will take what we need and cause no unnecessary harm to your civilians." Another pause, this one weighted differently. "That is more consideration than most worlds receive." The channel closed. Riker looked at Picard. "He thinks that was a generous offer." "He meant it as one," Troy said softly. "That's what frightens me." The Tal Shiar moved quietly, as it always did. While the Federation convened emergency sessions and the Klingon Empire nursed its wounded pride and its wounded fleet, Romulan intelligence had been doing what Romulan intelligence did better than any organization in the Alpha Quadrant: watching, cataloging, and calculating the precise angle from which an apparent disaster could be leveraged into strategic advantage. Sub-Commander Taris, operating from a cloaked Romulan warbird position at the edge of the anomaly zone, had observed every engagement from the initial Cardassian contact through the Klingon fleet's destruction with the careful attention of a scholar studying a particularly instructive text. Her report to the Tal Shiar Directorate was 40 pages long, meticulously sourced, and concluded with a single recommendation that the Directorate found deeply compelling. The Sardaukar could not be beaten by conventional means. But they could, potentially, be redirected. The Romulan Empire had a long history of redirecting forces it could not defeat outright. The entire neutral zone was a monument to that philosophy. What Taris proposed was more ambitious. A private channel to the Sardaukar command, an offer of navigational assistance and technical cooperation in exchange for the Sardaukar's military attention being turned toward the Federation rather than Romulan space. Let the grey-armored warriors exhaust themselves against Starfleet's vast resources. Let the Federation burn. When both sides were weakened, the Empire would act. It was an elegant plan. It was exactly the kind of plan the Tal Shiar excelled at. It failed within 6 hours of first contact with Aramsham's command staff, and it failed in a way that Taris, despite 40 years of intelligence work, had not anticipated. She had assumed the Sardaukar could be negotiated with, because everything could be negotiated with. Every power she had ever encountered had interests that could be mapped, pressure points that could be identified, and a threshold of self-interest that could be appealed to. The Ferengi wanted profit. The Cardassians wanted order and resources. Even the Borg, in their way, had comprehensible goals. The Sardaukar wanted nothing from the Romulans except, as Aramsham's intelligence officer communicated with clinical brevity, an assessment of your military strength and the location of your homeworld. Taris had broken contact immediately. The Warbird's cloak had been re-engaged within seconds. It was not fast enough. The Righteous Blade's sensor technology operated on principles sufficiently different from standard Federation or Romulan systems that the Warbird's cloaking frequency, tuned to defeat Starfleet and Klingon sensor sweeps, was partially transparent to it. The Sardaukar had not achieved a weapons lock. The cloak was still effective enough to prevent that, but they had tracked the Warbird's general heading for approximately 90 seconds before it moved beyond their sensor range. They know we were there, Taris reported to the Directorate. They know our cloaking technology exists. They will factor it into their tactical planning. The Directorate's response was 3 words: accelerate the timeline. What that meant, in practical terms, was that a team of 6 Tal Shiar operatives, the best infiltration specialists the Empire had produced in a generation, were transported by shuttle to Narendra 3 under cover of a humanitarian aid mission that the Federation had, with characteristic openness, permitted. Their mission was to make direct physical contact with Sardaukar command elements on the surface, bypass the communication failures of the space-based approach, and deliver an offer that Taris's team had spent 48 hours carefully constructing to appeal to whatever warrior culture framework these soldiers operated within. They landed at dawn, Narendra 3's pale sun just cresting the horizon over the occupation perimeter the Sardaukar had established with extraordinary efficiency. The gray-armored soldiers moved through the colonial settlement with disciplined purpose, securing infrastructure nodes, cataloging resources, and maintaining a visible but controlled presence among the civilian population. There had been no atrocities. Aramsham's order about unnecessary harm appeared to be genuine policy rather than diplomatic posturing. The Tal Shiar team observed this for approximately 4 hours before making contact. The Sardaukar sentries who intercepted them did not speak. They did not threaten. They simply formed a perimeter around the 6 operatives with the quiet, absolute certainty of people who had never once encountered a physical confrontation they could not control, and waited. Within minutes, a Sardaukar officer arrived, young by human standards, but with eyes decades older than his face. The senior Tal Shiar operative, a man named Varric who had successfully negotiated with Nausicaan pirates, convinced a Cardassian ghoul to change allegiances, and once talked his way out of a Klingon prison using nothing but his wit and a working knowledge of Klingon honor codes, presented the offer clearly and professionally. The Sardaukar officer listened without expression. When Varric finished, there was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the officer said in the flat, precise tones of the universal translator, "You have offered us the location of your enemies in exchange for our assistance against them. You believe this serves your interests." A pause. "It serves ours better. We now know your enemies are our enemies' enemies. We know you have cloaking technology. We know you consider yourselves subtle." He looked at Varric with something that was not quite contempt, because contempt implied emotional investment. "You are not subtle. You are afraid. Fear makes you legible." Varric was many things. He was not easily unsettled. Nevertheless, something in the Sardaukar officer's gaze, the absolute, uncomplicated assessment of it, the complete absence of anything he could leverage or appeal to, made the base of his spine go cold. "We are detaining you," the officer continued. "Not as prisoners. As intelligence assets. You will tell us, over time, everything we need to know about the powers of this quadrant. Not because we will harm you, but because people who are afraid always talk eventually." He tilted his head fractionally. "We are patient. 6 of the Tal Shiar's best operatives were escorted into the Sardaukar perimeter and did not emerge. When the Romulan shuttle failed to return, Tari sat in the dark of her Warbird's command center for a long time, thinking about what kind of enemy looked at the Tal Shiar's best infiltrators and saw not a threat, but a resource. "Send a full report to the Praetor," she said finally. "Recommend immediate border fortification and cessation of all contact attempts." She paused. "And tell them we cannot negotiate with these people. Tell them that clearly." The prisoner had been in sickbay for 31 hours, and in that time he had said exactly 9 words. He had been recovered during a Starfleet security operation near the Narendra 3 perimeter, not captured in any conventional sense, but separated from his unit during a controlled withdrawal when a pattern enhancer malfunction had beamed 3 Sardaukar soldiers aboard the Enterprise alongside a group of Federation civilians being evacuated from the settlement's outer districts. 2 of the soldiers had immediately and effectively disabled the security teams sent to intercept them before Worf personally restrained them, a process that had required 6 security officers, 2 compression phaser rifles used as batons rather than weapons, and what the ship's medical log described clinically as significant physical effort on the part of Lieutenant Commander Worf. The 3rd soldier, wounded during the struggle, had been brought to sickbay. His name, recovered from the Universal Translator's phonetic analysis of his identification tags, was something close to Chorus. He was approximately 30 years old by human physiological standards. He had 17 distinct healed fracture sites visible on his skeletal skin, 4 of them consistent with injuries sustained before physical maturity. He had muscle density exceeding any humanoid on record in Starfleet's medical database. He had a resting heart rate of 41 beats per minute and a neurological profile that Beverly Crusher had been staring at for the better part of 2 days. "His amygdala response to stress stimuli is unlike anything I've ever seen," she told Picard during the senior staff briefing, her medical tricorder data projected above the table. "In a normal humanoid, acute stress produces a measurable fear response, adrenaline surge, elevated cortisol, the standard fight-or-flight cascade. In Chorus, stress produces something closer to focused calm. His brain is literally wired to interpret threat as opportunity." "Conditioning?" Picard asked. "More than conditioning. This is architectural. Whatever process produced these soldiers, it began before birth and continued through every developmental stage. The psychological restructuring is so deep it's expressed in neurological structure. You can't undo this with therapy or deprogramming. This is who he is at the cellular level." Troy, sitting beside Crusher, looked troubled in a way that went beyond professional concern. "When I try to empathically sense him, I get almost nothing. Not the blankness of a null-empathic species or the shielding of a trained telepath. It's more like..." She paused. "Like looking into a space where the usual emotional frequencies simply don't exist. Fear, uncertainty, self-doubt, the psychological textures that most sentient beings carry constantly, even when they're functioning well, they're absent. Not suppressed. Absent." "What does he feel?" Riker asked. "Purpose. Clarity. A kind of physical satisfaction when he's performing at capacity." She was quiet for a moment. "And something I can only describe as belonging. He belongs to something larger than himself so completely that individual identity is almost secondary. It's not hive mind, it's not the Borg. He's fully individual. But his individual self is defined entirely by his role in the collective." Worf had been listening with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral. "He is a warrior," he said. "That is not so different from a Klingon. With respect, Lieutenant Commander, it is profoundly different," Crusher said. "A Klingon warrior chooses the path of honor. Chooses to die in battle rather than live in dishonesty. That choice is what makes it meaningful. Chorus didn't choose anything. The choice was made for him before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him." She looked down at her tricorder data. He was, in the most precise medical sense, manufactured. Built to specification. And he has no idea that anything about him is unusual, because he has never known anything else. Picard stood and moved to the door of the briefing room, pausing with his back to the table. Can he be communicated with? He speaks when spoken to. 9 words in 31 hours, as I said. But he's observant. He watches everything. He's been cataloging the ship, crew movements, access panels, security rotation patterns. He's not trying to escape. He's gathering intelligence. He's doing his job. Data said. Even in captivity, he is fulfilling his function. Precisely. Picard turned. Which means he is rational, purposeful, and operating to a coherent internal logic. That means, in theory, he can be reasoned with. If we can identify the framework within which his reasoning operates. He looked at Troy. I want you to speak with him. Not to deprogram or convert, simply to understand. What does he believe the purpose of this incursion is? What does Aramsham actually want? Is there an endgame that doesn't involve the subjugation of every inhabited world in the Alpha Quadrant? Troy nodded slowly. I'll try. But, Captain, I want you to understand something before I go in there. She met his eyes with the directness she reserved for moments when she needed him to hear her clearly. Whatever I find, whatever reasoning he presents, it will be internally consistent and entirely sincere. These soldiers don't lie to themselves. They don't rationalize. What Chorus believes is what the Sardaukar believe. And what they believe may be something that our entire framework of diplomacy has no answer for. The silence that followed was the particular kind that fell when everyone in a room understood that a problem might not have a solution they were prepared to accept. Troy visited Chorus that evening. She sat across from him in the clean, carefully lit sickbay room and looked at a young man with old eyes and a body built for war, and she asked him, simply and directly, why they had come. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in 9 words that the universal translator delivered with complete neutrality. We go where the Emperor's need sends us. Troy sat with that answer for a long time after she left. The projectile weapons were older than anyone in the Federation liked to admit they still had. Starfleet's conventional arms inventory, chemically propelled rounds, kinetic impactors, solid slug accelerators, existed in storage facilities on star bases throughout the quadrant, relics of a pre-phaser era that no one had seriously expected to need again. They were kept because Starfleet kept things, because regulations required contingency planning for scenarios where energy weapons were non-viable, and because a small but persistent faction of tactical analysts had, for decades, been filing reports suggesting that phaser dependency represented a strategic vulnerability that remained unaddressed. Those analysts were not celebrating their vindication. They were too busy pulling manifests. The request had come from Picard, phrased with characteristic precision, all available stockpiles of non-energy-based weapons to be inventoried, inspected, and distributed to security personnel assigned to potential ground engagement scenarios within 72 hours. Starfleet Command had approved the requisition with a speed that reflected how thoroughly the Klingon engagement had recalibrated everyone's threat assessment. The resources that arrived were not impressive. Aging ballistic rifles, slug throwers that hadn't been fired in anger since before most of the receiving officers were born, and a very limited supply of photon grenades whose explosive mechanism was kinetic initiated rather than energy triggered. Worf had looked at the inventory list for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, quietly and without irony, that it would have to be enough. He had been training security teams in hand-to-hand combat disciplines for 4 days straight by the time the situation on Narendra 3 escalated from occupation to active perimeter enforcement. The Sardaukar had begun extending their footprint, pushing the colonial population toward the settlement's center, while systematically stripping resource extraction facilities at the outskirts. They were efficient and, by their own standards, restrained. No killings, no deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, no brutality beyond the absolute physical certainty with which they moved through space and enforced their boundaries. But restraint had limits, and the limits were being tested by resistance. The colonial resistance had begun spontaneously, as it always did. not from military planning but from ordinary people who woke one morning and discovered that the building they had worked in for 20 years was now inside a Sardaukar perimeter, and that they were not permitted to enter it. The first incidents were minor. Then they escalated, as such things always did, and 3 Sardaukar soldiers were injured by improvised devices constructed from mining equipment. Aramsham's response had been measured by his standards and brutal by anyone else's. 16 colonists were detained as a deterrent. The Sardaukar perimeter doubled. And a message was sent to the Enterprise delivered in the flat, precise tones that Picard was coming to recognize as Aramsham's version of controlled anger. Further resistance would be met with proportionate response, and the Sardaukar definition of proportionate was not the Federation's. Picard had authorized a ground team. The team descended under cover of a humanitarian resupply convoy, genuine medical supplies that the Sardaukar permitted through their perimeter, because Aramsham had no interest in civilian casualties beyond their utility as leverage. Worf led the team personally, over Riker's objections and with Picard's explicit support, because Worf was the only officer on the ship who had trained for this specific engagement paradigm, and because Picard understood, though he did not say it aloud, that what was needed now was not a diplomat but a warrior who could think like one. The team made contact with the colonial resistance in the lower levels of a water processing facility, where 37 colonists with mining tools and fury had established a defensible position with more tactical intuition than formal training. Their leader was a woman named Sarah Vasquez, a civil engineer who had been building things on Narendra 3 for 22 years and who had, in the past week, demonstrated an unexpected gift for tearing them down strategically. "They don't use energy weapons in close quarters," she told Worf, spreading a hand-drawn map across a processing console. "We figured that out when we saw what happened when the Cardassians tried phasers near the shielded soldiers. So they go hand to hand. They're faster than us, stronger than us, and they don't get tired the way we do." She looked at him steadily. "But they do get tired. We've confirmed that." Around the 6-hour mark of continuous engagement, their reaction times degrade marginally. Worf studied the map. Marginally is not enough. No. But combined with terrain, timing, and the fact that they don't know this facility the way we do. She traced a route through 3 sublevels. Marginally might be sufficient. What followed over the next 9 hours was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a grinding, close-quarters campaign through industrial infrastructure, fought with slug-throwers and hand weapons and the intimate, brutal knowledge of terrain that only people who had lived somewhere for decades possessed. The Sardaukar were better fighters, individually and collectively. There was no avoiding that truth. But they were fighting in a building they had never entered before, against people who had been repairing its systems since childhood, in darkness that the colonists had deliberately created by destroying the power grid in a sequence that served no obvious tactical purpose until the Sardaukar were 3 levels deep and suddenly realized that the maintenance crawlways they were using as transit routes were now systematically sealed. Worf's team liberated the 16 detained colonists. They recovered 2 Sardaukar shield generators, damaged but intact, enough for Geordi to begin proper analysis. They inflicted, by final count, 31 Sardaukar casualties, of whom 9 were killed. It was the first successful ground engagement against the Sardaukar by any Alpha Quadrant force. It was also, Worf reported to Picard afterward with characteristic directness, not something that could be replicated at scale. "We won because we had terrain, surprise, and information," he said. "In an open engagement, on their terms, we would not win. Then we don't engage on their terms," Picard said. He was looking at the shield generators on the briefing table, and at Geordi, who was already taking them apart with the focused intensity of a man who had found the problem he'd been waiting to solve. "How long, Mr. LaForge?" Geordi didn't look up. "Give me 48 hours." The Emperor's ultimatum arrived on all frequencies simultaneously, broadcast across every communication band detectable in the Alpha Quadrant, translated by the Universal Translator into every language it had catalogued in the 3 weeks since the Righteous Blade had arrived. It was not a long message. Aramsham was not a verbose man. "To the powers of this quadrant, you have demonstrated valor, ingenuity, and the capacity for organized resistance. These are qualities the Imperium respects. They are not, however, sufficient to alter the fundamental reality of your situation. Our military capacity exceeds your combined ability to contest it on the ground. We do not seek the permanent subjugation of your populations. We seek one thing only, the technology or knowledge necessary to reconstruct our fold space transit capability and return to our own universe. Provide this, and we will withdraw within 30 standard days. Withhold it, and we will take what we need from your worlds one by one until we have assembled the knowledge ourselves. The choice is yours. You have 72 hours. The Federation Council chamber was quiet for a very long time after the message finished playing. There were 47 member worlds represented in that chamber. Their delegates had spent the past 3 weeks watching sensor feeds from Narendra 3, reviewing the reports from the Klingon engagement, reading Crusher's medical analyses and Troy's psychological profiles and Data's 17 separate tactical assessments. They had, collectively and individually, arrived at the same conclusion that Picard's senior staff had reached days earlier. There was no conventional military solution that did not carry a catastrophic cost. What they had not fully processed until this moment was the second clause of the ultimatum. Because the first clause, the demand for fold space technology, implied that Aramsham genuinely wanted to go home. And wanting something meant that a negotiating position existed. But the second clause, we will take what we need from your worlds one by one, revealed the shape of the alternative with stark, terrible clarity. He would strip the quadrant planet by planet if he had to. And based on everything they had observed, he had both the capability and the patience to do it. Picard, attending via subspace relay from the Enterprise, watched the Council's response with the attention of someone who understood that what was said in the next hour would determine the shape of the next month. The responses divided along predictable lines. 7 delegates advocated immediate capitulation, give Aramsham whatever he needed, get him gone, address the implications afterward. 12 advocated continued resistance. The rest occupied the complicated middle ground where most of Federation politics actually lived. The Klingon representative to the Joint Crisis Council, a general named Martok who had been present during the fleet engagement, and whose vessel was one of the 7 that had survived, made the most unexpected contribution. He stood without being recognized, which was not procedure, and said, "We are arguing about what to give him and whether to fight him. We have not asked whether what he wants actually exists." Silence. "He wants fold space transit technology," Martok continued. "We do not have fold space transit technology. The wormhole near Bajorans operates on different principles. Trans-warp conduits belong to the Borg. Standard warp drive is not fold space transit. It does not recreate the conditions that brought his vessel here." He looked around the chamber. "If we tell him this, and it is true, his ultimatum has no resolution. He cannot go home because what he needs does not exist in this universe." That changes everything. Picard opened his channel. "General Martok is correct, and I believe Aramsham already suspects it. The specificity of his demand, fold space transit capability, suggests he understands that standard warp technology is insufficient. The question is whether he has yet accepted that the technology he needs may not exist here, or whether he believes we're withholding it." He paused. "If it's the latter, there is no message we can send that will convince him. He will interpret any denial as obstruction." "Then what do you propose, Captain?" the Council President asked. "I propose that we show him, rather than tell him. That we open every relevant scientific database, every record of warp theory, transwarp research, subspace mechanics, temporal mechanics, to Sardaukar technical review. Not as capitulation, but as demonstration. Let his own scientists reach the conclusion that the technology doesn't exist here. Their confirmation will carry more weight with Aramsham than any of our assurances." A Federation Science Counselor leaned forward. "You're proposing we hand them our entire technological archive. I'm proposing we hand them the sections relevant to transit mechanics. Carefully curated and overseen, but genuine." Picard's voice was steady. Because the alternative is that we spend the next month fighting a ground war on every inhabited world in the border region, while hoping that Geordi LaForge can solve the Holtzman problem before Aramsham runs out of patience. The Council deliberated for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, on Narendra 3, the Sardaukar extended their perimeter by another 12 kilometers and detained 40 more colonists. On Bayer's doorstep, a Sardaukar scout vessel conducted a sensor sweep of the wormhole's mouth that made the Bajoran militia scramble every fighter they had. And in the Enterprise's engineering section, Geordi LaForge worked without sleeping on 2 damaged Holtzman field generators and a theory about phased energy modulation that he was almost certain would work and was not yet willing to say out loud until he was fully certain. The Council approved Picard's proposal with 31 votes in favor and 11 opposed. Aramsham received the offer of technological access with 36 hours remaining on his ultimatum. He did not respond for 6 of those hours. When he did, it was not with acceptance or rejection, but with a single question, delivered through the same all-frequencies broadcast as the ultimatum itself, and which struck Picard as the most honest thing the Burseg had yet communicated. If what you say is true, if the path home does not exist in your universe, what then? Picard sat alone on the bridge for a long moment after the message ended, the stars steady beyond the view screen, the question hanging in the recycled air of the ship like something physical. Then, he said quietly, to no one in particular, we find out what kind of people they really are. Betazed was chosen because of what it was, not in spite of it. The logic, as Data presented it, was precise and cold in the way that necessary things sometimes were. The Righteous Blade had been conducting systematic surveys of inhabited worlds for 3 weeks, assessing each for resource value and strategic position. Its survey pattern, extrapolated forward by Data's navigational analysis, indicated that Betazed would fall within the Sardaukar's operational radius within 9 days. Betazed was, by any military assessment, an ideal target, densely populated, resource-rich, minimally defended, and home to one of the Federation's most significant civilian populations. It was also the homeworld of Deanna Troi. Picard had not mentioned this when he proposed the plan. Troi had mentioned it herself, in the briefing room, with the directness that he had always valued in her. I want you to know that I'm aware of my potential bias, she had said, and I want you to know that I've assessed it, and I'm not compromised by it. Betazed is the right location for this plan because of its telepathic population, not despite it. If there's any place in the quadrant where the Sardaukar's psychological conditioning can be not just observed but genuinely engaged, it's there. The plan had 3 components, and each one required everything to go right simultaneously. The first component was Geordi's. After 42 hours of continuous work, 3 failures, and 1 minor explosion that had singed his left forearm and which he declined to have treated until the work was done, he had isolated a modulation frequency for the ship's phaser array that, in controlled testing against the recovered Holtzman generators, produced a dampening effect rather than a catastrophic interaction. It did not destroy the shields. It disrupted them for approximately 90 seconds before they recalibrated. 90 seconds was not long. But 90 seconds of conventional phaser fire was, against an unshielded Sardaukar soldier, entirely sufficient. The second component was Data's. The android had spent the same 42 hours analyzing the fold space transit data alongside Aramsham's scientific staff. A genuine collaboration, facilitated through guarded subspace channels, that had produced what Data considered a significant scientific exchange and what Aramsham's scientists had concluded, with evident reluctance, was accurate. The precise Holtzman field interactions that produced fold space transit did not have a natural analog in this universe's subspace physics. The technology could, theoretically, be reconstructed from first principles, but the process would require materials and manufacturing capabilities that would take decades to develop. They could not go home on any timeline that mattered. Aramsham had received this report from his own scientists 20 minutes before the Enterprise arrived at Betazed. Picard had timed this deliberately. The third component was Troy's, and it was the one Picard trusted least and needed most. The Betazed population had been briefed. What the briefing had asked of them was without precedent in Federation history: a coordinated, voluntary, mass empathic projection, 2 million telepaths broadcasting a single emotional signal outward toward the Sardaukar forces as they entered the system. Not an attack. Not a weapon. Something more precise and more difficult. The genuine, unmanufactured emotional reality of people who understood that they were about to be occupied, who had accepted that fear and grief and the fierce, particular love of a home world were real, and who were willing to share those feelings with soldiers who had been conditioned since birth to live in a world without them. The Sardaukar fleet dropped out of warp at Betazed system edge at 0300 hours, ship time. The Righteous Blade came through first, its escorts flanking in the practice formation that Picard had watched on a dozen sensor feeds by now, its weapons systems already sweeping the system for threats. What it found was the Enterprise, positioned directly between the command ship and Betazed. Alone. "They're hailing us," Worf reported. "On screen." Aramsham looked tired. It was the first time Picard had seen anything other than absolute control on the Berseg's face, and it lasted only a fraction of a second before discipline reasserted itself. But it had been there. The scientific report had reached him. He knew what it meant. "Captain," Aramsham said. The usual flat authority in his voice was still present, but underneath it was something that the universal translator rendered as weight. "Move your vessel." "I won't do that," Picard said. "And I think you know why." He let that sit for a moment. "Your scientists have confirmed what we told you. There is no path home through this universe's technology. Not in any time frame that serves your mission. Whatever brought you here has made you, in the most precise sense, stranded." Silence on the channel. "Occupying Betazed won't change that. Occupying every world in the quadrant won't change that. You are exceptional soldiers, Commander." Exceptional soldiers understand when the tactical situation has fundamentally changed and when the objectives that governed previous actions no longer apply. Picard's voice was quiet and completely steady. The objective was to go home. That objective is no longer achievable by force. So the question becomes, what do you do now? It was at that moment that the Betazed projection reached the Righteous Blade. No one on the Enterprise could know precisely what 42,000 Sardaukar soldiers experienced in that moment, the sudden, unmediated flood of emotional reality from a world of 2 million telepaths who had opened themselves entirely and broadcast the full, unfiltered spectrum of what it meant to have a home worth protecting. Fear. Love. The specific grief of anticipated loss. The stubborn, unreasonable courage of people who were not warriors and would fight anyway. Troy, standing on the bridge, closed her eyes. Tears ran down her face without any sound. "It's reaching them," she whispered. On the Righteous Blade's bridge, Coordinatrix Vel later reported, 37 of the 43 command staff members had stopped what they were doing for between 15 and 90 seconds. Some had gripped their console edges. One had sat down abruptly on the deck. Aramsham himself had stood completely still, his hands at his sides, his face turned slightly away from his view screen. The Sardaukar had been built without fear. They had not been built without the capacity to feel, entirely. They had simply never encountered anything that reached the parts of them where feeling lived. Betazed had. The ceasefire was not a treaty. Aramsham was clear about that. A treaty implied ongoing obligation, mutual recognition of sovereign authority, the infrastructure of diplomatic relationship that the Federation built between parties who intended to coexist. Aramsham did not use the word treaty because the word implied a future he had not yet decided on, and Aramsham did not commit to futures he hadn't fully assessed. What he agreed to, in a meeting aboard a neutral station at Deep Space Nine that Sisko had prepared with the careful attention of someone who understood that the wrong table arrangement could derail negotiations before they started, was a cessation of active military operations pending further discussion. The detained colonists on Narendra 3 were released. The Sardaukar perimeter contracted to the resource extraction sites Aramsham had identified as essential. The Tal Shiar operatives were returned, all 6 of them, physically unharmed and profoundly changed in ways that their psychological debrief would spend months trying to document. What Picard had understood, from the moment the Betazed projection had reached the righteous blade, was that the Sardaukar were not a monolith. They were soldiers, extraordinary, conditioning forged, psychologically remade soldiers. But soldiers are not their commanders, and commanders are not their emperors, and the emperor whose orders had sent the Third Legion through that fold space rupture was not here and would never be here and could not, by any mechanism available in this universe, issue new orders. For the first time in their lives, 42,000 Sardaukar soldiers were beyond the Emperor's reach. The conditioning still held. The discipline still held. The warrior culture and the hierarchy and the absolute obedience to command structure were all still intact. But the command structure had been reduced to what was present in this universe, and what was present was Aramsham, who was an exceptional military mind and, it turned out, also a man capable of reassessing a situation when the fundamental parameters changed. The reassessment took 3 days. Picard gave him the time, declining multiple requests from the Council and from Gowron and from a Cardassian Central Command still furious about the Cardassia Prime settlement to press for a faster resolution. He is working through something that has no precedent in his experience, Picard told the Council. Give him time to do it properly. On the 3rd day, Aramsham requested a private meeting with Picard aboard the Enterprise. No aides, no senior staff, no security. A request so against every protocol that Riker had spent 2 hours arguing against it before Picard simply walked into the transporter room and had himself beamed aboard the Righteous Blade instead, which was not what anyone had anticipated, and which seemed to register with Aramsham as something close to respect. They met in the Sardaukar commander's private quarters, which were as spare and functional as Picard had expected. No decoration, no personal objects, nothing that a life lived entirely in service to an external purpose required. My soldiers cannot serve a mission that has no achievable objective, Aramsham said without preamble. Conditioning that has no outlet becomes pathology. I have seen it happen over long campaigns. They need purpose, or they become dangerous, to everyone, including themselves. Yes, Picard said. This quadrant has frontiers. Aramsham's eyes were steady and direct. Your Federation's records, which your science officer shared with mine during the fold space analysis, indicate unexplored territory, contested regions, threats you lack the ground forces to address. A pause that carried the weight of a man dismantling something he had believed in for his entire life and rebuilding it around a new load-bearing principle. I am not proposing alliance. I do not know what we are. But I am proposing that 42,000 soldiers with no home to return to require occupation, and that occupation might be directed toward purposes less wasteful than conquest. Picard was quiet for a long moment. Then, that would require you to operate under a set of principles that are not your own. Rules of engagement, civilian protections, oversight. I am aware. Aramsham met his gaze. I am also aware that I am in a universe where my Emperor's authority does not reach and where the only law that governs me is the law I choose to recognize. A beat. A man of your experience will understand that this is a more dangerous situation than it appears. Picard understood exactly what Aramsham was telling him. That without the Emperor's authority to anchor his soldiers' conditioning, he needed something else to anchor it to, and that he was asking, in the most oblique and pride-preserving way available to him, for help building that something. It was the most human thing Picard had ever heard from him. Then let's talk, Picard said. The talks lasted 11 days. They produced no treaty, no formal alliance, no documents that could be filed with the Federation Council as a clean resolution. What they produced was an arrangement, provisional, contested, deeply uncomfortable for every party involved, that the press characterized variously as an unprecedented diplomatic achievement and an unconscionable accommodation of invaders, depending on which species was doing the characterizing. The Sardaukar Third Legion established a semi-permanent encampment on an uninhabited moon in the Narendra system, under terms that included joint oversight, defined operational boundaries, and a communication protocol with Starfleet at Worf, who had been assigned as the primary liaison with audible displeasure and evident private satisfaction, described as functional. Narendra III was rebuilt. The Cardassian diplomatic protests remained formally unresolved and practically ignored. The Klingon Empire declared that no outcome of the engagement counted as a defeat because the Sardaukar had ultimately ceased their advance, which was technically true and satisfied no one. Chorus, the Sardaukar soldier who had spent 31 hours in sickbay speaking 9 words, asked Beverly Crusher before his discharge why she had continued to treat his wound when he was her enemy. She had told him, as simply as she could, that her oath made no distinction. He had considered this for a very long time. He had not responded. But when he left, he had paused at the door and turned back, and for the first time in their acquaintance his eyes carried something other than assessment. He said, "Your oath is a form of conditioning." "Yes," Crusher said. "Then I understand it," he said, and left. Picard wrote his log that night in the quiet of his ready room, with a cup of Earl Grey growing cold beside him and the stars of the Alpha Quadrant steady beyond the viewport. The same stars, unchanged, indifferent to the fact that the civilization beneath them had been permanently altered by 3 weeks of an impossible situation. "The Sardaukar came as conquerors and remained as something we have no category for," he wrote. "They are not enemies, not allies, not refugees, not citizens. They are soldiers without a war, conditioning without a cause, loyalty without an object. What we have offered them is purpose. What they have offered us is something more uncomfortable, the recognition that our principles, tested against an adversary for whom those principles held no meaning, proved more resilient than I had dared to hope, and more fragile than I had allowed myself to fear." He set down the log. Outside, the stars burned on. What the Federation did not know, what even Aramsham did not yet know, was that the fold space rupture that had brought the righteous blade to this universe had left a residual scar in subspace, a thin and slowly widening tear in the boundary between dimensions, detectable only to instruments tuned to the precise frequency of Holtzmann field resonance. It was growing at a rate that suggested it would become significant in approximately 14 months. What lay on the other side of it, whether more Sardaukar or something else entirely, was a question that Starfleet's most sensitive sensors were beginning, very quietly, to ask. The Sardaukar had come looking for a way home and found instead a universe that offered something their own never had, the possibility that purpose could be chosen rather than assigned. Whether that possibility would redeem them, corrupt them, or simply complicate an already complicated quadrant remained, as Picard had once noted about all the most interesting questions, entirely open. In the end, the Federation's greatest weapon had not been the phaser modulation that Geordi had worked 42 sleepless hours to produce, nor the shield generators that Worf had risked his life to recover, nor the vast diplomatic machinery of the Council and its accumulated centuries of statecraft. It had been 2 million people on a green world who had simply, bravely, opened their hearts and let soldiers who had never been permitted to feel anything feel something real. Whether that was victory or merely survival, the Federation was still deciding. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.